The dinner air tasted of burnt garlic and 9 years of buried resentment. Julian stood by the sink, his knuckles white against the porcelain. He looked at me with a cold, unfamiliar sharpness that sliced through our domestic quiet. My husband hissed. I left a better woman for you. He waited for me to crumble or scream. I simply nodded. Then go find her, I said. I walked out without a suitcase. The heavy thud of the front door felt like a physical weight lifting off my chest. I drove toward the city lights, my hands steady on the leather steering wheel. Silence was my new architect. I checked into a hotel under my maiden name, feeling the ghost of my old self wake up. That night he texted, "Please talk to me." The screen flickered in the dark room, casting a clinical blue light across my face. He followed it with 5 more messages, each one more desperate than the last. He thought I was hiding in a parking lot. He didn't know I was already typing. By dawn, my laptop screen was a battlefield of spreadsheets and hidden bank statements. I found the transfers he thought I would never notice. Small amounts, frequent and rhythmic, sent to a name I had not heard in 10 years, Elena. He was funding a fantasy while I paid the mortgage. My lawyer sent the final draft at 7 o'clock in the morning. I printed the pages in the hotel lobby, the paper warm and smelling of fresh ink. Each signature felt like a vow. Julian was about to lose his safety net. I returned to our driveway just as the sun began to bake the pavement. The house looked like a hollow stage set. I didn't go inside. I pinned the red folder to the front door with a single, aggressive strike of a staple gun. The bright plastic stood out against the expensive oak like a fresh wound. I sat in my car at the end of the block and waited. A locksmith's van pulled up behind me, ready to change every lock the second Julian stepped outside. The neighborhood was far too quiet. Julian finally pulled into the drive, his tires crunching over the gravel. He looked disheveled, his expensive suit jacket tossed carelessly into the back seat. He saw the red folder immediately and froze. But when he saw the documents waiting outside, his face dropped. He didn't just see divorce papers. He saw the printed records of his financial fraud and the photos of his secret meetings. He reached for the handle of the front door, but his key wouldn't even fit in the lock. He was suddenly a stranger on his own porch. I rolled down my window and let the morning breeze fill the car. Julian turned toward me, his mouth hanging open in a silent, pathetic plea. He looked small against the backdrop of the house I had built for him. I didn't offer him a single word of comfort or explanation. I simply shifted the car into drive and pulled away from the curb. In my rearview mirror, he was just a diminishing speck standing among his own trash bags. I finally realized that better was a lie I no longer had to believe. I drove straight to my lawyer's office, while the adrenaline still hummed in my veins. The city traffic moved like sludge. My phone buzzed in the cup holder with a relentless, frantic rhythm. Julian was calling again. I watched the screen glow and fade, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a busy signal. He needed to feel the silence. He needed to understand that the reliable woman he mocked was gone. The office air was cold and smelled of old paper. Mr. Sterling looked at the red folder on his desk and then back at me. He didn't ask about my reddened eyes or the way I gripped my purse. He simply opened the digital file and began scrolling. The numbers didn't lie. Julian had drained exactly $40,000 from our joint savings over 5 months of time. It wasn't just lunch dates with Alina. He was paying off her credit cards. I felt a sharp, icy clarity settle over my heart right then. We spent 2 hours mapping out the financial wreckage. Sterling was precise. He explained that since I could prove the funds were used for non-marital purposes, we could claw them back from Julian's share of the house equity. It was a surgical plan. I felt like an architect designing a tomb. Every document I signed felt like a brick in a wall I was building between us. By noon, the initial filings were ready for the court. Julian had no idea. I left the office and walked into the bright, midday heat. I needed to see her. I needed to see the woman Julian thought was worth ruining our lives for. I drove to the boutique where Elena worked, a high-end place with velvet curtains and gold trim. She was standing near a display of silk scarves. She looked tired. There were dark circles under her eyes that no amount of expensive concealer could hide. She wasn't a goddess. She was just another person. Alina looked up when the door chime rang. Her expression shifted from professional curiosity to recognition, and then to a flat, dull fear. I didn't cause a scene. I walked over and placed a copy of Julian's bank statements on the glass counter. Her hand trembled as she saw the highlighted transfers. I didn't say a word. I just watched her realize that the money she thought was a gift was actually stolen from a wife. She looked physically ill. I leaned in close enough to smell her heavy perfume. I told her he was broke now. I explained that the bank accounts were frozen and the house was being sold to cover his debts. Her eyes darted to the door, as if she expected him to burst in and save her. He wouldn't. Julian was likely sitting on the curb right now, staring at the front door. Elena didn't look like a better woman. She looked like a cornered animal in silk. I walked back to my car feeling a strange, hollow victory. My phone buzzed one last time as I turned the key. It was a voicemail from Julian. His voice cracking with a mixture of rage and terror. He said he was going to tell everyone what I'd done. He claimed I was the one who had destroyed the family. I deleted the message without listening to the end. Then I saw a black sedan pull up behind me in the mirror. The black sedan sat idle in my rearview mirror for several long seconds. I didn't recognize the vehicle, but the way it hugged the curb felt intentional. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I put the car in gear and slowly pulled away from the boutique. The sedan followed, keeping a precise 2-car distance behind me. I turned onto a side street, then another. The shadow remained. Someone was watching my every move now. I navigated toward a crowded shopping plaza to find safety in numbers. My hands were slick against the steering wheel. I parked near the grocery store entrance and waited for the sedan to pass. It pulled into a space 3 rows back. A man stepped out. But it wasn't Julian. He wore a dark windbreaker and held a camera with a long lens. He wasn't a threat, he was a professional. Julian had hired a private investigator to follow me. The realization made me laugh, a dry and brittle sound in the small cabin. Julian was trying to catch me in a lie to save his own reputation. He wanted evidence of an affair to counter my claims of his theft. I stepped out of the car and walked directly toward the man. He looked startled and tried to hide the camera behind his leg. I stopped a foot away from him. The air smelled of hot asphalt and exhaust. "I hope you're getting my good side," I said with a sharp edge. The man stammered, his face turning a blotchy red. I told him that Julian's checks would likely bounce by Monday morning. I advised him to get his payment in cash before the bank freeze took full effect. His eyes widened as I handed him my lawyer's business card. I told him he was working for a ghost. The power balance shifted in an instant. He looked confused. The investigator admitted Julian had told him I was the one hiding money in offshore accounts. It was a classic projection. Julian was paying this man to prove a fantasy that didn't exist. I felt a surge of cold pity for my husband's desperation. He was drowning and trying to pull me under with him. I thanked the man for his time and walked back to my car. My resolve felt like tempered steel. I had work to do. I drove to our local bank branch before they closed for the weekend. I needed to secure the safe deposit box containing my grandmother's jewelry. The lobby was quiet, the marble floors echoing with every step I took. I showed my identification to the teller and followed her into the vault. The heavy steel door groaned as it swung open. Inside, I found my box, but the lock felt loose. My stomach plummeted as the lid clicked open far too easily. The velvet lining was empty. The diamond brooches and the gold pocket watch were gone. Only a small, handwritten note remained at the bottom of the metal box. It was Julian's messy scrawl. He hadn't just taken the cash from the accounts. He had raided my inheritance weeks ago. I stared at the empty space where my history used to live. He had planned this betrayal long before our argument. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Alina. The text from Alina was a single grainy photo of a pawn shop receipt. I stood in the vault, the cold air biting at my skin. Julian had traded my grandmother's legacy for quick cash. The objective was no longer just a clean divorce. It was total recovery. I marched out of the bank, ignoring the teller's worried glance. The sun felt like a spotlight on my failure. I had let him in too close for too long. I drove to the pawn shop, listed on the crumpled receipt. It was a squat building with bars on the windows and a neon sign that buzzed. The interior smelled of dust and old metal. I showed the clerk my identification and the police report I had filed on the way over. He looked at the paper and then at me. He told me a man, matching Julian's description, had been there yesterday. He had left with a thick envelope. The clerk pulled a heavy tray from behind the counter. My heart stopped. There they were. The diamond brooches sparkled under the harsh fluorescent lights, looking out of place in the grimy shop. But the gold pocket watch was missing. The clerk explained that Julian had sold that piece to a private collector. My stomach twisted into a hard knot of fury. That watch was the only thing my father had left me. Julian had truly gutted me. I paid the recovery fee with my last personal credit card. Every swipe felt like a gamble. As I walked to the exit, the door chime rang again. Elena stood there, her face pale and her eyes darting around. She wasn't here to fight. She looked like she had been crying for hours. She held a small velvet bag in her hand. She walked toward me and placed it on the counter without saying a word. I held my breath. I opened the bag and felt the familiar weight of the gold pocket watch. Elena whispered that Julian had tried to give it to her as an apology. She had realized the truth after I visited her boutique. She didn't want his stolen peace offerings. She wanted out of the mess he had created. I looked at her and saw the reflection of my own past exhaustion. We were two women used by the same weak man. The tension finally broke. Alina admitted Julian was hiding at a cheap motel, on the edge of town. He was planning to leave for the coast tonight. He had the rest of the cash from the bank accounts in a briefcase. I realized he wasn't just running from me. He was running from the debt he owed to dangerous people. He had gambled away more than just my money. The private investigator was likely working for them, not him. The stakes had just changed. I thanked Alina and walked to my car. The gold watch heavy in my palm. I had the jewelry back, but Julian was still a loose end. I looked at the motel address she had scrawled on a napkin. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the parking lot. I needed to reach him before the creditors did. As I pulled away, I noticed a second black sedan waiting at the corner. He wasn't alone. The motel was a decaying neon monument to desperate choices. I parked my car 2 blocks away and walked through the cooling evening air. The second sedan I had spotted earlier was gone, but the silence felt heavy and wrong. I found room 14 at the back of the lot. The curtains were drawn tight. I didn't knock. I used the spare key I had taken from Julian's dresser weeks ago. The lock turned with a dry, metallic click. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap whiskey. Julian was sitting on the edge of the saggy bed, staring at a leather briefcase. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a hollow, frantic energy. He didn't reach for the bag. He didn't even try to stand. He looked like a man who had finally run out of road. I placed the recovered gold watch on the bedside table. The ticking sounded like a heartbeat in the gloom. "Elena gave this back to me," I said. My voice was a steady blade in the dark. Julian flinched at her name. He started to ramble about how he was trying to double the money to pay me back. It was the same lie he had told himself for years. He claimed he was a victim of bad timing and worse luck. I didn't interrupt him. I just watched his hands tremble. He was a small man playing a very dangerous game. I reached for the briefcase and clicked the latches open. Julian surged forward, but I shoved him back with a strength that surprised us both. The bag wasn't full of cash. It was stuffed with legal notices and unpaid gambling markers. There was only a thin stack of hundreds on top. He hadn't just stolen my jewelry. He had already lost the proceeds. The better woman was never the problem. Julian was simply a parasite who had finally hit bone. The power dynamic shifted as I pulled a second document from my coat. It was a formal confession of theft I had drafted with Sterling's notes. I told Julian he had 2 choices. He could sign the paper and leave the state tonight, or I would call the men in the black sedan myself. His face turned a sickly shade of gray. He looked at the window. Realizing he was trapped between my cold justice and their violent debt collection, Julian grabbed a pen and signed the paper with a shaking hand. He didn't even read the clauses. He just wanted a way out of the room. I took the document and the remaining cash. I told him the house was already being processed for a short sale. He had nothing left but the clothes on his back. He started to sob, a pathetic sound that made my skin crawl. I turned toward the door without a second glance. I walked out into the parking lot, the signed confession tucked safely away. My car was waiting under a flickering streetlight. I felt lighter than I had in a decade. But as I reached for my door handle, a man stepped out from the shadows. It was the private investigator from the plaza. He wasn't holding a camera this time. He held a thick, manila envelope addressed to me. He looked genuinely sorry as he handed it over. I took the envelope with a steady hand despite the chill. The investigator looked away, his jaw tight. I walked to the safety of my car and sat in the driver's seat. The dome light cast a sterile glow over the contents. Inside were legal papers, but they weren't about the divorce. They were life insurance documents. Julian had taken out a massive insurance policy on me several months ago. The beneficiary wasn't the estate or a trust. It was Alina. My breath hitched in my chest. The realization was a cold blade through my ribs. Julian hadn't just been stealing my money or chasing an old flame. He had been planning a permanent exit for me. The better woman comment wasn't just a slur, it was a projection of his intended future. He needed me gone to settle his debts with the men in the black sedans. The briefcase of markers in the motel was only half the story. I was the actual currency. This changed every single rule of the game. I looked back at the motel room door. Julian was still inside, weeping over his own misfortune. He didn't know I had the insurance files. He didn't know the investigator had flipped. I felt a surge of cold, calculated fury. I wouldn't just leave him to his creditors. I would ensure he faced the full weight of his intent. I pulled my phone out and dialed Sterling. My lawyer answered on the second ring. I told him we needed the police. Now. Sterling's voice was sharp with professional concern. He told me to stay in the car and lock the doors. He would coordinate with the local precinct immediately. I watched room 14 through the windshield. The neon light above the door flickered and hummed. A shadow moved behind the thin curtains. Julian was packing his meager belongings. He still thought he was leaving for the coast. He still thought he was the one in control. He was wrong. A siren wailed in the distance. 2 patrol cars swept into the lot with their lights dark. They moved with a quiet, lethal efficiency. I stepped out of my vehicle and handed the officer the insurance documents and the signed confession. He scanned the papers and signaled to his partner. They approached room 14 with hands on their holsters. The air felt heavy with the smell of rain and ozone. I stood by my car, a witness to the final collapse. The door to the motel room burst open. Julian was dragged out into the harsh light of the parking lot. He was shouting about his rights and his innocence. His eyes found mine across the pavement. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, primal terror. He looked at the documents in the officer's hand and realized the investigator had betrayed him. I didn't look away. I wanted him to see the exact moment his world ended. He had traded my life for a gamble. Now, he was the one being discarded. The officers pushed him into the back of a cruiser. The metal door slammed with a definitive, final thud. One of the men from the black sedan watched from the edge of the lot. He didn't move toward the police. He simply nodded at me and stepped back into the shadows. They didn't want the police involved, but they also didn't want a dead debtor. I had inadvertently saved Julian's life while destroying it. The irony tasted like copper. I felt a strange peace. Sterling arrived 10 minutes later in a silver SUV. He walked over to me and checked my pulse like a concerned doctor. He told me the insurance fraud alone would carry a heavy sentence. Added to the theft and the gambling markers, Julian was finished. We stood together in the cooling night air. The motel sign finally flickered out, leaving us in the dark. I handed him the briefcase with the remaining hundreds. "Use this for the filing fees," I said. He nodded. The drive back to the hotel was a blur of streetlights and empty intersections. I kept the gold pocket watch in my lap, feeling its steady weight. The ticking felt like a countdown to a new life. I had reclaimed my history and my future in a single, violent night. Julian would go to a cell, and I would go to a new city. The reliable wife had become the architect of her own salvation. I pulled into the hotel parking lot. I walked into the lobby and asked for a late checkout. The clerk smiled at me, unaware of the wreckage I had left behind. I went up to my room and sat on the edge of the bed. I took a deep breath of the recycled air. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message from an unknown number. "You missed a page," it read. Attached was a photo of a second insurance policy. This one was on Alina. The image on the phone screen felt like a physical blow. Julian had not just bet on my death. He had hedged his bets by placing a price on Alina too. The cold realization flooded my mind as I sat on the hotel bed. He was playing a double game of tragedy where he was the only winner. He didn't care which one of us died first, as long as the payout cleared his debts. Julian was a monster hiding in a cheap suit. I realized I had to reach Alina before the men in the black sedan decided to change their target. If Julian was in custody, they would look for the next quickest way to collect their blood money. I grabbed my keys and ran back to the elevator. The lobby was empty now, the air smelling of lemon wax and fatigue. I drove through the sleeping city, my heart racing against the clock. The streets were ghosts of gray and neon. I had to act. Alina lived in a garden apartment complex that looked peaceful and far too vulnerable. I parked on the curb and saw her unit on the second floor. A single light was burning in the window. I checked my rearview mirror and saw a familiar pair of headlights turn the corner. It was the sedan again. They were moving in. I didn't wait for them to stop. I sprinted toward the stairs, my boots thudding against the concrete. I had to get inside. I pounded on her door until she opened it, looking startled in a silk robe. I didn't say a word. I just shoved the phone under her nose and let her see the second policy. Her face went from confusion to a pale, sickly green. She understood the math immediately. Julian had set us both up to fail. We were nothing more than insurance line items to him. She stepped back, letting me inside. I locked the deadbolt and the security chain. "They are outside," I whispered. We stood in the dark kitchen, the only sound being the hum of her refrigerator. Alina started to shake, her hands clutching the marble counter. She asked if Julian had really meant to hurt us. I told her the truth. He didn't care enough to hurt us. He just wanted the money. We were obstacles he intended to liquidate. A soft scratch sounded at the front door. Someone was testing the lock. My blood turned to ice. I pulled Alina into the bathroom and told her to climb into the tub. It was the only room without a window. I took a heavy iron skillet from her stove and stood in the hallway. The scratching at the door stopped. Then, the wood groaned under a sudden, heavy pressure. They were trying to force the frame. I felt a strange, cold calm settle over me. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the one protecting the better woman Julian had discarded. The door frame splintered with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. I waited in the shadows, my grip tight on the iron handle. A man stepped into the light of the hallway. He wasn't the private investigator. He was much larger and held a short, blunted tool. I didn't give him time to look around. I swung the skillet with everything I had. The metal connected with his shoulder with a dull thud. He stumbled back, cursing under his breath. "Police are on the way," I shouted into the dark. It was a lie, but it worked. The man looked at his partner in the doorway and signaled for a retreat. They didn't want a murder charge on top of a debt collection. They vanished into the night as quickly as they had arrived. I stood in the wreckage of the door, breathing hard. My hands were shaking now. I had saved us both from Julian's final gamble. The silence was deafening. Alina crawled out of the bathroom, her eyes wide with terror and a strange new respect. We sat on her floor until the sun began to peek through the blinds. She thanked me for coming back for her. I told her I didn't do it for her. I did it because Julian didn't get to win. We were both survivors of a man who saw people as currency. We made a pact right then. We would testify together and bury him under the truth. As the morning light filled the room, my phone buzzed with a notification from the bank. The freeze on the accounts had been lifted for a brief window to process the court fees. I saw a final transaction that made my heart stop. A large sum had been moved into a trust 5 minutes ago. It wasn't Julian or the creditors who had moved the money. It was the private investigator. He hadn't flipped for me or Julian. He was draining the entire recovered settlement for himself. I stared at the blinking notification on my phone screen, while Alina sobbed quietly beside me. The private investigator had played us all like pawns on a cracked chessboard. My objective shifted from survival to absolute retrieval. I dialed Sterling again, but the call went straight to voicemail. The investigator had likely used his technical access to hijack my cellular connection before making his final move. I felt a cold, sharp clarity replace my fear. I wasn't just a wife or a victim anymore. I was a hunter reclaiming her life. The morning light felt like an intrusion as I drove toward the investigator's office. I had to intercept him before he reached the airport. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel. Alina sat in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. We reached the brick building just as a silver car pulled out of the garage. It was him. I didn't hesitate. I swerved my car across the exit, blocking his path with a screech of tires. The investigator rolled down his window, looking more annoyed than afraid. He told me that the money was already in a digital vault beyond my reach. He claimed he earned it by protecting me from Julian's hitters. I laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. I showed him the secondary recording I had made during our first meeting. I had caught him admitting to his ties with the debt collectors. The power shifted back into my hands. He went pale. "Give it back," I said. My voice was a low, steady hum of pure intent. He hesitated, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. I told him that Sterling had the backup data stored on a secure remote server. It was a bluff, but the sweat on his forehead told me it worked. He opened his laptop and began the reversal process. I watched the numbers move back into the escrow account. The digital tide was finally turning in my favor. Julian's trial lasted only 3 days, but it felt like a lifetime of exposure. He sat behind the defense table, looking diminished and hollow. Alina and I stood together as the primary witnesses. We didn't look at him when we spoke our truths. The insurance policies were the final nails in his coffin. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison without the possibility of early parole. The better woman and I walked out of the courtroom into the fresh air. 6 months later, I sat on my new balcony, overlooking the quiet river. I finally understood the truth. I never needed to be his first choice, because I was my own ultimate priority. The lie of the perfect marriage had burned away to reveal a stronger foundation. I poured a glass of wine and watched the sunset. My phone buzzed with a message from a new number. I didn't recognize the code. I deleted it without reading. I was finally free.